Welcome to Session 9. Tonight we're going to be looking at the issue of resources and power. We're changing our strategy quite significantly from the lectures that we've had over the past several weeks. The reading is more theoretical, it's more difficult, and yet it takes us into a new dimension of our understanding of leadership. To help us reflect upon the kind of temptations, as we've been doing in the last 2 weeks, that affect leaders, I'd like to turn in my Bible to Matthew chapter 4 and reflect for a moment tonight on the temptation of Christ. In this particular gospel, the scriptures tell us that Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil, and after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." This first temptation is the temptation that Henry Nouwen calls the temptation to be relevant. Obviously, Jesus was hungry. He had a specific need at that particular point in time to be fed. And he had the power of God to be able to turn stones into bread. Satan said, "Do it. Go ahead. You have the power." So oftentimes in leadership, we have power, and there is a great temptation to meet the present need using the power that we have. Power is always a part of leadership, and it can become a critical agenda for us as we are tempted to use it for the benefit of the people that we're working with, to try to cope with the situation that we're presently involved in. I know I like to do things that make people happy. We talked about the agenda last week of getting support, and satisfying people's demands is the key part of getting support. Well, the temptation to meet people's needs, the temptation to be relevant, the temptation to provide for whatever is needed at that particular point in time is a crucial part of leadership. Nouwen tells us that we should not yield to this temptation, even as our Lord did not. Our Lord said, "Man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." So we have to resist the temptation to meet all of the needs of people. We have to recognize that God's Word is central to what we do, and that our lives are to be ordered by that Word and not by the need to be relevant, the need to meet people in their situation. As we reflect on power tonight, we're going to be talking about resources. We're going to be talking about the agenda to use power in leadership. But before we get into that, I want to caution you at the beginning that the temptation to be relevant is always there when we have resources and we are able to use them. Okay, welcome to the whatever session this is, Lecture 17. I can't remember. I think this is about the 11th session, right? We have this one and 4 more to go. So the lecture for tonight is on page 45 in your syllabus, and the subject is the book by Richard Adams and a Theory of Power. Adams' focus is one that concentrates on the relationship between energy, resources, and leadership. And our discussion tonight is going to ultimately come back to that. The fact that leadership always is related to resources is a very important agenda. But as we begin, I would like to remind you of the text that we considered in our devotional time in Matthew chapter 4, of the fact that Jesus did not use resources, his power, to feed himself when he was hungry. And that the whole issue of Christian leadership is one to understand when resources are an important agenda and when they are not. And we'll come back to that and look at that perhaps a little bit later. But let's dig into this issue of resources and see how important they are and what relationship it does have to leadership by discussing for a few minutes this chapter by Adams and to understand something of the dynamics of what he considers in it. First question in our syllabus is, how does Adams define power? As you've read this reading, how would you respond to that? Speak up.
Control over energy.
Okay, control over energy. What does that mean to you, John?
Well, it means to me that the people that control over energy, which eventually relates to control of somebody else's environment.
Okay, so you use the environment as a defining factor. How about some of the rest of you? What else is involved in this idea of control over energy? Okay, resources. Explain a little more, Stephen. Louder.
Resources, yeah. By resources, I'm focusing on, I'm thinking of having access to different things that could be used in a, say, an organization.
Okay.
Things that could.
Things that can be used in an organization. Let's take a village in Nigeria. What would be resources common to a villager? What would a chief in Nigeria use as resources?
Land.
Okay, land would be one. What else?
Oh, okay.
People.
People, right. You've got people to work for you. People that you can call for labor. What else?
Skill.
I'm sorry?
Skills.
Skill, okay. Skill is not really an energy resource. Skill is the technology to utilize resource. So skill is important, and it has to do with the next step in the utilization of resources. It's basically the technology that one uses. But as you think about this, can you think of any more resources?
Machines.
Okay, machines. All right, machines.
Animals.
Animals, excellent. Okay, that's right. Any kind of material or animal or being that can be utilized for what? What do we use them for? What do we use land, animals, skill?
Production.
Production. Okay. And the issue then is production for what?
For survival.
Okay, survival, right? And what else?
Accumulating wealth.
Okay, wealth. And what else?
For development.
Okay, development.
Developing the community, for instance.
All right, all right. Development of the community, so that basically you have, let's call it the public good, if you will, the development of the community. You use an abbreviated term here. So the public good is as important as wealth, which is the private good. Can you think of anything else that goes with this in terms of leadership?
You maintain your leadership, too.
Okay, that's right. And there you come to power.
It would also give you bargaining power, wouldn't it, with other coalitions?
Exactly. Bargaining power with other coalitions. You see, it's important to recognize that if a leader controls land, for example, then the leader can allocate land to certain people and expect certain things in return because the leader can take it away if the leader truly controls it. If the leader controls production, then the leader can control the products, what comes from production. Or if the leader controls a portion of production, that's related to it. The feudal system in Europe is a very good example of this. The feudal system in Europe, the lords owned the land. So what did they do? They gave the land to tenant farmers. And those tenant farmers were to produce on the land. But when they produced, the feudal lord took the products. And so the tenant farmer did the work. The tenant farmer did the harvesting. When the harvest came in, part of the harvest always went to the lord of the manor. And that's how the lord of the manor fed himself and his household and all those others that worked for him, because he controlled the land was his. If the tenant farmer didn't do the good job, he kicked him off the land. Now, in the 14th century in Europe, there was a shortage of tenant farmers because of the Black Plague that swept across Europe. And there were lots of lords who didn't have enough people to work for them. And so what the lords did is they tried to steal tenant farmers from other lords. And for a while there, it was a good thing for the tenant farmers. They got good deals from the landowners because the landowners had a scarcity of laborers. So you see here that environment resources, labor, is an important resource. And having farmers was a very crucial part of the Lord's power. If he didn't have those farmers, his resources weren't any good to him because the resources had to produce, the land had to produce food, grain for the Lord to be wealthy. So the whole idea of control over energy is a complex one, which includes resources like land, resources like water, resources like people, labor, who can work on the land. Or if we bring it into our modern context, when somebody builds a factory, they expect that there will be people around that will work for them at the wages they want to pay. So when General Motors decides to build a factory in Mexico, why do they do that?
Cheaper labor.
Cheaper labor. That's right. They decide that if they build it in Mexico, they can get labor there, and their factory will be able to produce at a lower cost. And so they'll be able to manufacture automobiles, and they can do it at a profit. When they decide to move out of one place and build a new plant in another place, usually it's for the fact that their resources are more accessible in the other place. Labor resources, or maybe natural resources, whatever it is that they think they need to be most efficient. And the old machinery that they have in Michigan, Pontiac, Michigan, for example, may be defunct. It may not be producing at the level of productivity they want, and they decide that also the labor costs are so high in Pontiac, Michigan that they'd rather go down to South Carolina or go to Mexico. And if they build their factory in Mexico, they can build a brand new factory, all new equipment, much more efficient, requiring less labor, and the labor will be cheaper because they don't have to pay the wage rate they would have to pay in Pontiac, Michigan. So those kinds of decisions go into why you build a company in a particular place. And leadership ultimately comes back to this issue of control over energy. So when Adams talks about power, what he's really saying is that power always comes down to these fundamental issues. And if we want to understand how power works, we have to understand that power is connected to energy and resources. In this discussion, we can then think about Christian leadership in terms of resources. And what kind of resources do Christian leaders have? Why is it that resources are an important part of Christian leadership? I just came back from Korea on Tuesday morning, and I can tell you that the Korean pastors that I met were very powerful in terms of resources. The last church that I attended was a church that had over 50,000 members. I preached in the 5th service on Sunday morning. There were 7. Okay? There were about 8,000 to 9,000 people in each service, so that the services were full, 7 services. And the churches were very dynamic, and it was a very wonderful place to be and to be able to speak. But to come now to the issue of power and resources, on Sunday afternoon after church, I was taken to a hotel, and the pastor said, Elder so-and-so, who is sitting here with us, will be paying our dinner bill and our hotel bill, and your hotel bill. I was very grateful and thankful, and I thanked the pastor and thanked him. But how could the pastor do this? Well, the elder was part of the church group, and the pastor asked him if he would take care of this, and he did. Okay. Now, the bill happened to be $740, and it was taken care of by the pastor. I found that out a couple of days later. Then the next day, I was told after I preached in the morning, was taken out to lunch, that Elder so-and-so took us to a particular restaurant out on the beach overlooking the sea coast, and Elder so-and-so was hosting us to dinner, and he was paying the bill. That evening I had a meal at another restaurant which was owned by a member in the church, and the members of the church were paying the bill. They took care of that. Now, you can't tell me that the pastor doesn't have control over resources. Now, he doesn't directly control them, but he has the ability to ask in his leadership role members who have resources to do things, and they do it because of their loyalty to him and their loyalty to the congregation and what they want to do. Now that's a significant, I'm sure, as I look back at that the lunch the next day cost $200 because the place where we were was not an inexpensive place. It was an expensive place. I happened to have to pay for a dinner, one of those dinners myself in one place, and was shocked at the sticker price. You know, these places are not cheap. And it was one of those things where, as I'm introduced to this context, this pastor has a tremendous amount of resources and power. Now, we then have to see that his Christian leadership is not devoid of environment, resources, skill, and labor. He was really calling upon the members of the church to labor on his behalf, to provide assistance on behalf of this visiting speaker. And the church building was a huge building. So there is tremendous resource there. A huge complex with large educational facilities and several auditoriums. The auditorium that I preached on Monday afternoon had 900 students in it, and it was half empty. Okay, that was the second auditorium, probably where the original church had been. And the auditorium that I preached on Sunday morning held about 8,000 people. And so there, you know, probably it was 2,000 people in the auditorium on the afternoon service and 8,000 in the auditorium for the Sunday service. And then there were other smaller auditoriums yet in the church complex. So there clearly was a large physical plant. There were people with resources that were loyal to the pastor and would work with the pastor. There's a tremendous amount of resource and labor accessible to that pastor, which are part of his leadership. Now, the pastor can utilize that resource and that labor for good or for evil, just like any leader can. It could be abused. It could be used with great honor for the Lord's work. I can tell you this, that this church has a tremendous missions program. And probably their missions budget is larger than their local budget. I don't know that for a fact. I didn't ask those questions. I didn't explore it. But I know they have more than 60 missionaries in the mission field. And so, you know, that's a significant investment that they've made, a significant commitment that they've made. They have many ministry programs. The church has 2,000 cell groups. Okay, cell groups, maybe 20 to 30 people in a cell group. So they've got a leadership program in which those cell groups are led, and so on and so forth we have. There's a lot of labor because every one of those cell groups has a leader of the cell group. And so there's a tremendous organization that is involved here. So when Adams talks about power as the control of energy and resources, you cannot say that this doesn't exist in a Christian context. And if we do, we're blinding ourselves to a fundamental aspect of our leadership relationships, and we will not recognize how crucial it is to manage resources in a godly way. And that's really the fundamental issue. If we say resources are not important in leadership, then we won't deal with them biblically. And we must recognize that resources are crucial, that leadership always involves resources, leadership always involves the control of energy, and that has to be an important part of our biblical agenda as well as our leadership agenda. Now, let's jump down to question 3. What is Adam's distinction between power and control?
Control is non-reciprocal and power is reciprocal.
Okay, excellent. Control is non-reciprocal and power is reciprocal. Okay, what does that mean? Amy?
Control is the things they don't have their will or response to, like material things.
Okay.
So they won't expect things out of you. You just control them.
That's right.
But reciprocal is a relationship over people, over.
Okay, relationship over people. All right.
And then you will get feedback, expectation, back and forth.
Okay, good, good. There's an expectation. There's an exchange between them. That's excellent. Okay. As you think about these issues, then, give me an illustration of control, somebody. How many of you drove here tonight? Okay, a couple of you over here. Were you in control or not?
Yes.
What? What were you controlling?
My engine.
Okay, you were controlling your automobile. Okay.
Didn't control the freeway, though.
Okay, you couldn't control the freeway, right. Okay. Now, if you were cutting in front of people, then you were exercising power. Okay? But not over your car, you see. You control your car, okay? But you don't have power over your car, because power is a reciprocal relationship. So power is when you cut in front of somebody and they yield. Okay? Or power is when you try to cut in front of them and they won't yield and push you back to where you were going before. In other words, that's a reciprocal relationship. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we talk about the difference between control and power. So when the pastor says to an elder, I'd like for you to host the Lingenfelters today, is it control or is it power?
Power, they can resist.
That's right, it's power. They can resist.
Or they can.
The pastor does not control them. They agree to do it. Okay? They agree. Now, I think this is a very important distinction, and I think it's helpful to understand that, because what Adams is saying is that power relationships are ones in which there is a reciprocal exchange between people. Okay? That I participate in power. If somebody comes up to me and says, I have a gun, give me your wallet. Now, if I give them my wallet, I have engaged in a reciprocal relationship. I have granted that person power over me because of their gun. It's been coercive, but I've granted it. But if I say to them, forget it, I'm not going to give you my wallet. And they say to me, if you don't, I'll shoot you. I said, go ahead, shoot me. And they shoot me and take my wallet. They have not had power over me, but they have controlled me. Okay? Because they've basically taken something from me by killing me, shooting me, or incapacitating me. And I have not reciprocated giving them power over me. Effectively, I said, I deny that. You do what you want, but I won't give you my wallet. Now, the issue here then is control is one of those things where you control objects, you control land, you control water, you can control automobiles, you can control a particular skill. The skill can't respond back to you. It's, you know, hey, I have the ability to do this, so I'll do it or not do it. My knowledge, for example, of this discipline and what I share with you is something that I control. Okay? But power is one that involves an exchange between people. And that's what Adams is trying to get at. Sue?
So you controlled your wallet then?
Yes.
Okay, and he controlled the gun.
That's right.
Okay, when you grant him power, then does he now control your wallet?
If I give it to him, yes.
Okay.
That's right.
So kind of an exchange of that control of that resource.
That's right. And in fact, what I've done is given up the control over my wallet in a power relationship. I said, okay, you have power over me. Don't shoot. I'd like to live a little longer. It's more important living than having my wallet, so you can have it. Okay, and that then I've given up control of my wallet because of this power relationship. Now, the same thing happens when the elder says, would you host the Lingenfelters? And I think it would be great if they stayed in this hotel and we had dinner there. Okay, the pastor says that. Then the elder in the power relationship says, okay, I'll do that. Now, the elder knows that then he can expect uncertain help from the pastor at other times as well. There is a reciprocal relationship there, that it's not going to be the pastor always asking and never giving, that you're going to expect there is something back. There will be a loyalty, there will be some kind of support, there will be an opportunity to assist and encourage. In this particular case, the elder is also interested in sending his daughter to Biola. And the application is here, but the daughter hasn't been accepted yet. So there is an expectation of reciprocal relationship. And that's not a negative because it wasn't stated. But, you know, as he acts in terms of what he controls, and I accept what he controls in terms of the meal and the hotel, then there is some sense of commitment and obligation, certainly on my part, a feeling of, yeah, I would do everything I can to help him, appreciate his hospitality, you know. But it wouldn't have been necessary. In other words, I would do that for any student. You know, I want to help all students get into the school, but it makes you feel a greater burden and responsibility in terms of that situation. And so you have that. Stephen, speak loudly.
So even when a leader dictates, tries to force all his followers to obey him, That is, we call that power and not control.
Exactly. Because if the followers comply, okay, if they comply, they have submitted to that exchange. And they have said, it's like the man with the gun. When you submit to him, then you have engaged in a power relationship. You've given your wallet. You may not have liked to have done it, but you've given it up. And the leader who says to his congregation, I expect you to do this, and am demanding that you do it, they do it because they have some sense of loyalty, some sense of the spiritual leader having power over them, or whatever it might be, feeling a sense of pressure in the community. But it's all what Adams is calling power relationships. They're reciprocal in the sense that people comply or don't comply with them. And if I refuse to comply, then effectively I've said, I will not give you power over me. And I think that's the important issue to work with. Okay, let's go on. We've really answered question 4, what does Adams imply by the continuing reciprocity of power relations, and can you illustrate this in the church? That's essentially what we've been discussing. So let's go on to 5. How does Adams define authority? Anyone remember this? Amy, what have you got?
Well, it's a behavior or quality ascribed to the exercise of control and power.
Okay, behavior quality ascribed to the exercise of control of power. Can you interpret that for me?
An ability to reward or to punish.
Okay, all right.
There's a skill, authority, and power.
Okay, good. Go ahead and talk. What's the difference between skill authority and power authority? Maybe that'll help clarify it for us.
Power is symbolic, has to do with symbols,
Okay.
and skills have to do with actual abilities to do something.
Okay, this is symbolic. And skill authority has to do with ability. Okay, can you illustrate these for me, John?
Well, symbolic power in terms of symbol, it would be, for example, if you gave me a document that said that I could make all your decisions regarding the provost office for one day, that document would be a symbol of your power. I would not actually have your power, but I would be taking power from you for that.
Okay, all right, good. You wouldn't have my power, but you would take it if I gave you the power to do it for a day. All right. Let me give you a different illustration, but it connects in the same way. Last year, one of my deans, the Dean of Continuing Studies, went to Korea. While he was there, he traveled around in the city of Seoul by bus and by subway. This year when I went, I was not allowed to get on a bus or a subway. Everywhere I went, someone drove me. Usually the school would send a driver, the university sent a driver to pick us up and take us to the school, and often use the same driver to send us back. And the person arranging my trip was one who would call and say, well, could you provide transportation for us? There was no problem. They always did so. Now, the issue here is that they controlled the transportation. Okay? The issue of getting me to and from was really a symbolic issue. You see, here is the provost, the senior vice president of Biola University. We don't want the provost riding on the train to our university. That would be a reflection on us as not being hospitable, because this is an important person, if you will. Okay? Now, of course, that says nothing to do about me. It has to do with the symbol, provost and senior vice president. Not Sherwood Lingenfelter. It has to do with the symbol of the university, the university's prestige, and whether or not this person should come by way of public transportation, or whether this person should be brought in a car. Now, the interesting thing about this is that I did not control the rides. Okay? But because I was provost and would ask for a ride, I had power to get that ride. Actually, I didn't ask for it. My colleague asked for it. But that creates a whole series of of responses in turn just because of the title that I happen to have and the position that I occupy here at the university. Now, if you were to go to Korea as a missionary, probably no one would volunteer to take you around in rides anywhere because you don't have any symbolic power. It's not related to some sense of where you fit in terms of your authority and position and organization. On the other hand, you have some very significant skills, the ability to do, the ability to be an evangelist, the ability to teach. I have those similar kinds. I have skills, you know. They weren't really, one thing they did ask me to do was to preach. Now, to preach, I had to have the skill to preach. And one of the questions they asked was, did I have an MDiv? Now, it created a little bit of anxiety for them when they were told that I didn't have an MDiv. Because you see, the MDiv is a symbol of skill, okay? And without the MDiv, then maybe I didn't have the ability to preach. And so then it was confirmed that I preached in Biola's chapel and that I preached in various churches in America. And the fact that I was licensed as a minister in my own denomination gave them then some feeling that, well, maybe this wouldn't be a bad thing and we could allow him to do this. But there was a real question because I didn't have the symbol of the skill. The MDiv, you see, is the symbol of the skill. So that created a little bit of anxiety and tension.
But the MDiv was not necessarily the skill.
That's correct. That's right. And in fact, there are many people that have MDivs that don't know how to preach. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this is that my interpreter told me after the week was over that she had no idea that I could preach so well. That this was an anxiety that she had when we left, that it wouldn't be very well done, and that it might be an embarrassment to Biola. Fortunately, the Lord has given me the gift of preaching, and so I wasn't an embarrassment to Biola. But it is, in fact, a skill, and it is a gift. And, you know, that's something that is part of authority, okay? That if you do that well, you have then some authority that goes with that. And interestingly enough, because of my preaching in Korea, I have much more authority there now in that regard than I had before I left, because of the skill that people recognized as legitimizing to my authority. Now, if we look at these two things, then I had symbolic power because of my position, and that relates to authority again. Authority is something that is social. It has to do with the legitimacy of what we do. In other words, authority defines legitimate exercise of power. And I think that's crucial to understand. Authority is the legitimate exercise of power. So, if I call up a university and say, we don't have transportation, could you provide transportation for us? And I am the provost of Biola University, then there is the symbolic power kicks into action and they come and pick me up. But if you are a student entering the university as an exchange student and you call up and say, I don't have transportation, they'll tell you, well, take such and such a subway or such and such a bus, and that will bring you down to the university. So in effect, what they're saying is that you don't have the legitimate authority to ask for a vehicle to come and pick you up. That to have that authority, you must have a symbolic title that goes with it. It has to be part of that. In fact, my colleague, Dr. Norman, when he went, they didn't treat him in the same way because he was just a dean. And I don't know where the level of cutoff is, but you know, I certainly experienced that. In fact, my wife and I were a little frustrated because we wanted to ride public transportation. We would have preferred to ride the buses just to have the experience and see what it was like. But we weren't given that privilege. We had to ride in the cars provided because that was deemed symbolically appropriate. Now, these two things are important in terms of leadership again, because as you look at what happens in leadership structures in any place, there are the power authority relationships and there are the skill authority relationships. And how they operate and what the dimensions of them are, you need to understand in terms of how they're developed.
Which one of those would give more authority, have more authority?
It all depends on the context. For example, in this particular situation, I have most authority because of my skill as a PhD, which in social anthropology and my prior publications in teaching on leadership. If I didn't have those skills, my faculty would not allow me to teach this course.
But in going to Korea, it was your symbolic power. That
Oh
you
yeah,
were
of
provost.
course, of course. You see, that's why I say the context is so important. Here in this classroom, my authority is based upon my skill. And it just so happens that because I've had the privilege and opportunity to serve as provost of the university, that my skill authority is somewhat enhanced. In other words, before when I would teach this course and never having served either as a pastor or in any kind of significant leadership roles, the students can say, well, how do you know? What have you done? You know, where have you exercised this? Now I can tell about all my mistakes. And then you have a better appreciation. Yeah, well, the skill relates to some exercising of power authority in terms of real relationships.
What kind of authority would Billy Graham have?
Both power authority and skill authority. And I say that because of the fact that over the years, when he first began preaching, when he had his campaigns in Los Angeles and other places back in the 50s, Billy Graham only had skill authority. In other words, that authority was based upon his preaching and people coming and responding to the gospel. But over the years, Billy Graham became a national name. He became a national symbol of evangelism in America. And so when Billy Graham called to Japan just a few months ago and said, I'd like to hold a campaign in Tokyo in 1994, everybody said, oh, of course, we'll do that. And the Japanese churches are now mobilizing in support of the Billy Graham Crusade in January of 1994. That is power authority because of his national recognition, the symbolic presence he has as an international evangelist. And it's interesting when some of the people in Japan introduced me to Koji Honda, they said he's the Billy Graham of Japan. Okay? He's a national evangelist there who has the same kind of stature and reputation. So he again has symbolic power, but it grew out of his skill as an evangelist, his exercising, his ability to preach and to bring people to Christ. Now, that's why these two things are not always separate. They interplay with one another and operate in that context.
The off subject or not, but people like Peter, he didn't have the skill, authority. He didn't probably have much power authority, but he had divine authority. So when he preached, he was a fisherman and still drove 3,000 people, and people, listened and also converted. So would you also add one more authority that's...
Adams doesn't talk about spiritual authority. And obviously that's a dimension that we must talk about, and we'll talk about it more next week. Tonight we're focusing on the material, okay? But I would argue with you that Peter did have skill. That his skill emerged very early as a leader. Peter's skills are even illustrated in the Gospels. When Peter attempts to take control at the time Jesus was crucified, when Peter is a spokesman early on advising Jesus and counseling what to do, Peter is an outspoken, opinionated, direct person who had the capacity for leadership. In other words, he was an assertive person, and you see him asserting himself incorrectly through the Gospels. And so his assertiveness was a skill. He was naturally assertive. And being naturally assertive, God took that and channeled it and used it for his glory. And we'll see some of that as we reflect on this in the second lecture tonight. So it wasn't that he didn't have skill authority. He was not well educated. And so the Lord took his gifts and filled him with the Spirit and enabled him to preach and teach in a way that was profound and that brought men to Christ. But it's interesting that the Lord took the most assertive and aggressive individual of his 12, and he was the leader of the church for the first decade.
Natural gift could include, be considered as a skill.
Sure. And Peter's leadership as a fisherman, he led, in other words, if you look in John 21, Peter said, I'm going fishing. The others followed him because he had the ability to stimulate men, to get them going. I mean, he was what you might call a spark plug. Somebody that initiated activities that got things going. You remember what he tried on the Mount of Transfiguration? Hey, let's build some some booths here. Peter was always building something. He wanted to accomplish things. He had this agenda to set out and do things. So in that, he did have skills. the Holy Spirit channeled them and used them in terms of his ministry for the glory of God and for the building of his church. Sorry.
See, like in the third world countries, the skill and power, so often skill like the degree become a symbolic power too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Exactly. The transformation of a degree from a skill into symbol is very common and happens very quickly in developing countries. And it does here to some extent as well. If people introduce you as Dr. So-and-so, then all of a sudden you have authority that you wouldn't have otherwise, when in fact it may be completely unfounded. I might be a doctor in mathematics and people give me authority in the church because they're called doctor, and I may know nothing about what's going on in the church and may not be very effective in terms of leadership. But just because I have the titles, then people can elevate you to a symbolic power. Okay, I want to define some of Adam's concepts quickly here as we're working on a limited time frame. Adams talks about granting, allocating, and delegating power. And I want to focus on each one of these but let's begin with the idea of independent. What do we mean when we talk about independent power? Okay, I control the resources. Okay, so what illustrations have we used tonight that show that?
The pastor had independent power over his elders.
Okay. In that one, no. No. I control my wallet. That's independent power. You control your car. That's independent power. There's nobody else that has to comply with it. See, when the pastor controls the elders, they have to comply. So in that one, there's a different dynamic working. It's independent when you have authority and control over the resource and nobody is intervening between you.
Wouldn't it be called independent control then, and not independent power?
Well, it's independent in the sense that you can give it to somebody else. In other words, if somebody then wants to deal with you, you basically have the power over resources and you manage them independently in your social relationships with others. So let's say that we all live in a town and each of us has control over a certain amount of land. I have control over the land. Now, whether or not I use it for the town's good or for the church's good is really up to me. And every time we have a discussion, people have to negotiate with me as to whether I'm going to participate or not. That means that I control my resources, I do it independently, and there are processes that I can interact with, and that's what the next concepts are about.
So it's not necessarily non-reciprocal then?
Well, it's in this sense what you're saying is, yeah, for the power that I have over my resources, no one else has any direct contact with it. I control it by myself and do what I please with it. So in that, you might have, for example, the landlord who has a tenant. If that tenant cannot move anywhere else, if there's no possibility of that tenant to move in any other direction, that no one else will take that tenant. If the tenant flees, the landlord can go get him and bring him back. Then the landlord really has independent power over the tenant. That the tenant really has absolutely no choice. That the tenant is controlled in the context by the system which gives no one else the ability to take that person. A slave, for example, the landlord has independent power over a slave. The slave can flee, but the landlord can then go after him, arrest him, and the slave has no recourse. So that in independent power in that context is one where there's absolute control over a resource, including a person. Okay. Now, in thinking about granting power, granting is what? Giving to somebody else. And
To delegate? Oh.
no, not yet. Okay, granting is basically I saying, I'll let you do this. Okay. For example, Sue says, can you give me $10? And I say, sure. Okay, I've granted power to her over $10. And she has it. Every time you go to church and put money in the offering plate, you're granting power. You're granting power over your money. It's your money. You control it. When you go there, you're granting power to whoever it is that's going to use that money. It may be the staff. It may be the elder board, whatever it is, maybe the church budget, you know, and you're contributing to the church budget. But effectively what you're doing when you give that money is you're granting power over it. And you're granting it to the organization or to a person or whatever it might be. So for example, if Murray says to me, Sherwood, can you come and help me move next week? And I say, sure. Okay, then I'm granting power to him over my labor. And I work with him to help him move. If 3 of you come in and say, Dr. Lingenfelter, we're struggling with our paper, could you help us? And I say, sure. Let's set aside a half an hour and we'll work on it. So that I'm granting you power over a half hour of my time. As I'm granting it. Somebody asks for me an appointment. When I give that appointment, I'm granting power over that time.
What if you say, sure, I'll do it. Will you come next week and rake my lawn?
Okay, then
is that still granting when you start doing this?
Yeah, because you're still, then you're asking for something back, and you grant that back. And it's between 2 individuals. It has to do with us having something we control and giving it to one another. So you've asked for an immediate reciprocity, whereas you could just grant it and expect some later reciprocity. For example, I give Sue $10. I might not ask for anything back. But Sue now knows she has a debt to me. Okay? In most cultures, debt is something that has to be repaid at a later time.
If you lock her in, though, and you say, I'll give you $10 if you come and do it, if that's locked in and she agrees to it, is that still considered
it's still
granting?
Yeah, because the other person has to pay back at a given time.
Okay.
Okay. So, in thinking about this granting, then, it's that exchange between 2 people. And it's really focuses on the individual granting power. If you can talk about this, they grant separately, okay? Granting is a separate activity. And that's an important part of this process. Granting is a separate activity. Okay. The next thing that Adams talks about is allocating. Okay, now the difference between granting and allocating is that allocating is collective. And there is a good reason for making this distinction. Grid and group. Remember we talked about grid and group earlier in the course. Okay, low group means individuals doing individual things. High group means collectives doing collective things. Granting is a phenomenon of low group activity, individuals granting separately. Allocating is a phenomenon of high group activity, groups collectively granting power, if you will, or Adams uses the term allocating power. Now, the key thing about allocating, then, is that the collective can give power or take it away. The collective decides. When a church votes to accept a pastor and give that pastor the responsibility of being pastor, they're allocating power. Okay? Because they collectively have decided to give this particular person the job. Now, when the church decides that the pastor is no longer doing what they want him to do and they vote him out, they're collectively withdrawing the power. They're saying, we will not support them. Or let's put it in terms of missionaries. If you are supported as a missionary by individuals, they are granting power to you over their resources. If you are put on a church budget, you have been allocated power by the collective group over that resource. And so, as you go about building support, you need to realize that there are many individuals who will support you by granting power over their money to you and saying they're trusting that you will do God's work for them as part of their extension of their ministry by giving in support of your missionary project. When you go to a church and the church decides collectively to support you, they vote to agree to support you. They're effectively allocating power to you, again, giving you resources, finances to support your particular ministry. These 2 things are very important to understand because they require different kinds of reciprocity. In the granting of power to individuals, it's the individual that you have to reciprocate with. And you have to continue to maintain that reciprocity. But if it's the collective, then it's the collective you have to reciprocate with, and the collective may make quite different demands than the individual does in terms of what you do. I know, for example, some churches, to put you, there's a church here in Whittier that if they're going to support you, they require that you spend a 6-month internship in terms of their church program for missions. And I know a couple who were on the mission field for 12 years. And they came back to this church and asked if this church would consider supporting them. And they effectively had to come home from the mission field and spend 6 months with this church before the church would they supported them during that 6 months, but that was a condition of their support. And so the collective allocates on the basis of certain kinds of its own reciprocal conditions. Individuals do it on terms of their own reciprocal conditions. And so that process is one that operates in the collective frame. Any question about that? Is that clear? Okay. The last one is delegating power. And delegating is just what it says. You understand the concept. If we can use Adam's terminology, which we have in the syllabus there, the receiver is dependent upon the giver. One delegates power to many. So if we can use it in that term, one to many. Now, the board of Biola University has independent power. What that means is that the board can make the decision to sell the property. They can make the decision to close it down. They can make a decision to change the curriculum, fire the individuals, whatever. They have independent authority. They're not accountable to anybody except themselves. In other words, they're really independent of anybody else in this process. And so if they decided that the Biola had gone liberal, that the president and the provost and all those other people were really taking the school in the wrong direction, they could shut it down. They could effectively, they have independent authority over it. And whereas we're all involved in relationships with them, it's important in this framework to see this independent authority as the key distinction to make. Now, they delegate that to the president, the complete authority to operate the university. They don't delegate to him ownership of the land. They don't delegate to him ownership of the resources. But they delegate to him the authority to operate the university totally. The president delegates, he's one, to 4 vice presidents. 4 vice presidents then delegate to their directors and deans. And the directors and deans then delegate to others. And so we operate and conduct the business of the university on the basis of this delegated power. Now, in delegated power, those who have it can give it to others, but the person who gave it can take it away. So, for example, if I make a decision that the president doesn't like, he can take it away. He can say, no, I'm overturning that. I will do what you want. I will do this. If I make a decision, the deans make a decision that I say is not correct, I can overturn that decision. I can say, no, you can't do that. I'll take the power back. Delegated authority, then, is one that you give, but it can be withdrawn as well. And it's given to those that work with you. Let's go to the church now. The congregation allocates collective authority to the senior pastor. The senior pastor delegates authority to staff. Okay? And staff may delegate authority to lay leaders. It may operate in that way. And so, let's say that the congregation has allocated to the pastor the authority over all of the services and all of the ministries of the church. The pastor then delegates the preparation of the worship service to one of the junior members of the staff. The junior member of the staff then plans who will sing, who will play the piano or the organ, what songs will be sung, all of that the junior staff member may decide to do. And he brings the program into the pastor, and the pastor says, well, I don't like this hymn. I want to sing this hymn on Sunday, so they change it because the pastor who's delegated authority now takes it back to do what the pastor feels appropriate in that particular context. You see then this framework of allocating and delegating be an important part of the process of leadership as we understand it and operate with it.
Yeah, I guess I'm seeing something even more different than granting it's separate and delegating one to me. It's like when you gave me the $10, you know, granted that to me, then it's like I could do anything with it. But with delegating being, you give me that $10 and say, Sue, I want you to go to the store and buy this, this, and this.
That's right. If I tell you, Sue, here's $10, I want milk and bread and cookies and the change. Okay. At that point, then, I've given you authority over the money, but told you what you have to do with it. And if you don't do that, then I may get angry with you because you haven't spent it in the way that you're supposed to. In other words, I've given you authority over the money. I don't tell you what kind of bread or what kind of cookies or what kind of milk. You could get whole milk or no fat, or you could get, you know, right, you get whatever you want with that. You know, I've told you that's basically what you're supposed to spend it for. But if you go there and you buy pop instead of milk, I say, Sue, I told you to get milk. You know, I don't like pop in my cereal. So, you know, at that point, you have that kind of delegating gives you some direction.
Okay, so granting, you give control, but delegating, you retain control and just give authority.
That's right. In delegating, you retain the right to take it back. You define how it shall be used. So, for example, the President has delegated to me $12 million in budget. Okay, but I can't go and use that any way I want. You know, I'm supposed to use that to support all of the educational and instructional programs and the co-curricular programs in the university. And I decide, well, the $12 million this year, I'm going to allocate it differently. I'm going to not give any money to Talbot. I'm going to start a new school, you know, and hire a whole bunch of new faculty and forget Talbot. And so I cut their budget and take it. I won't be in the office long. You know, I'm gone because it's delegated for the purpose of supporting the existing schools and programs of the university, not for me to change and do with it what I please. Now, I have some flexibility, but really very little flexibility. And my authority over that $12 million is pretty much limited, with flexibility coming in somewhere around maybe $200,000 at the most, of any flexibility at all. Okay, and the deans don't have flexibility either. When you give them $5 million, they have already salaries of 80 faculty they have to cover. And so then they can't just say, well, I don't like this faculty member, I don't like that faculty member. We'll get rid of them, we'll bring on some new people. It doesn't work that way. There are all kinds of rules. So delegated authority is quite complex with all kinds of constraining rules. Okay. Okay, I guess we're at a point where we need to close. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we're on Lecture 18, page 46 in your syllabus. The title of this lecture is The Analysis of Power and Authority Structure in the New Testament. Before I begin this lecture tonight, I would like to take just a few minutes and talk about the difference in authority and power between two churches that I've just had the opportunity of observing, the church in Japan and the church in Korea. I think that this illustration will be helpful to us and give us then a sense of how to assess these churches in relationship to what the Scriptures teach in the New Testament. I've had a chance to observe the church in Japan on 2 different occasions. I shouldn't say that the church. I should talk about the Baptist churches belonging to an association of General Baptist churches called Rengo in Japan. I expect, however, that that organization is fairly typical, although I cannot demonstrate that because I have not observed other leadership groups. However, in looking at the organization of this group, I had the opportunity back in 1990 to observe the executive committee of the whole of the Conference of Baptist Churches in Japan in a meeting together, and I observed an executive committee with the Executive Women's Committee having a meeting after the Women's Rally at which I was a speaker. The key leaders of this church allowed me to participate in both of those situations and to participate in their full meeting. I also observed the pastors in their relationships with one another and in conducting some business outside of the executive committee meeting. In looking at the Japanese organization, I was also able in this past 2 weeks to watch the Japanese work in conducting 2 meetings in relationship to Biola University's interest in Japan, and saw how they organized their meetings and how they conducted their discussion there. Out of that, I would like to just draw a brief diagram that I think will illustrate something of the way the structure works. In the meetings that I attended just this last week, the meeting was organized usually in a square kind of framework like this. There were people sitting all around the square, and the people who were leaders sat up here at this end, and other people who were in them sat around. It was this type of organization, with maybe this being the kind of the head table. In looking at the nature of the organization, the leaders who sat here at the head table were the organizers of the sessions. They were the ones who actually called the meeting and who were the key people in charge, the most senior people. For example, at the meeting I had in Tokyo, at this head table, there was the person who was the chairman of the Ochanomizu Christian Center, and the person who was the executive director of the Ochanomizu Christian Center. I was at the head table because I was one of the key speakers. And the director of the Bible Institute, Ochanomizu Bible Institute, was the one who served as my interpreter. And he was given that responsibility because he's a key leader in that group. So they all were at the head table. Key pastors in the organization. Oh, there was another man there who was the head of the Billy Graham crusade, and also who had organized the meeting and who was the chairman of the Rengo Baptist churches, who had been very supportive of Biola in this process. So all these key leaders were at this head table. There were other important pastors and leaders around. They tended to sit wherever there was space available when they came in. There was no sequence of order in terms of where they sat. So this gives you a sense of the organization and how it worked. The discussion in this particular meeting was one in which there were issues addressed. The nature of this whole meeting was to present Biola University's program in Japan, and then to talk about its implications for pastors. We were asking them for support. And the interesting thing about it is that as the meeting drew to a close and decisions were made, the senior member of the Ochanomizu Christian Center said that the Christian Center would help, but he would have to take it to the board before he could approve it. He didn't have the authority to approve it himself. Now he's, as I mentioned him before earlier tonight, he's the Billy Graham of Japan, the executive director, the chairman of the board of this particular center. But his comment is that I cannot make this decision myself. I have to bring it to the board. It's a very important comment because it shows that his authority really is connected to the board, and the board has to approve. So authority is collective, and if we can pick up a term that we haven't used yet, it's really a majority rule kind of authority. They would take it to the board would vote on it, and if the board approved it, then they can do it. And the interesting thing of it is that the leaders here could not make this decision without the approval of the group. There was another meeting in Osaka in which we had a similar setup. Very same kind of head table, different people. And after that meeting, there was quite a bit of discussion and debate, because in the Osaka meeting, the question was raised as to whether Biola should establish an extension and whether the churches should support it. And one of the men at the head table clearly wanted the churches to financially support the establishing of an English language institute in Osaka in cooperation with Biola. The discussion produced some debate and some opposition. There was particularly one pastor on this side and one pastor on this side who spoke out against it rather vocally. This person over here, in fact, this was a woman who was a pastor, was saying that the Japanese young people need special attention and care. They have difficulty when they go cross-culturally, and that this whole idea of sending students to study English language at Biola, they really need to be sure that our students get special care. This man over here was saying that Biola extension and church support is something that would be difficult. He said if the churches have to support it, it won't be successful. If Biola is willing to do it, it will be. And I'd already made it pretty clear that Biola couldn't put any money into this because we don't have it to invest, that if the churches want to do it, they have to support it. So the man who was the head said to me afterwards, he said, I really could not make my position open here because there was too much opposition. And he said, so I didn't make any proposal. I didn't say what I thought needed to be done. He said, I have to work to build more support before I can make the proposal. And so at this particular point, we agreed to continue the discussion. In fact, we were kicked out of the room before we were finished discussion. So we all went downstairs and assembled in very much the same kind of a format by pulling chairs out in a lobby and sat down and in a circle discussed these issues further. And there was more of the debate and the dialogue. And finally, at the end of that, the one who had called the meeting, the man who was in charge of it, said, well, we'll work on a proposal and we'll get back to you. So the leader who had a very strong position of what he wants to do and a very strong agenda deferred trying to get that agenda approved because he saw that there was discussion in the group that required further dialogue and further building of support, and he waited, in fact, chose not to do it at that time. So if you look at the dynamics that are going on here, the leadership is collective. And it clearly is a majority rule kind of phenomenon, and if the leaders sense that there is not majority support or there's enough dissension that we can't get it, the leader backs away from trying to make a decision and move toward it. When I watched the Rango Executive Committee work, there was a little bit of a different situation. They weren't sitting in tables like this, but if we assumed that there was a table here in the center, what we did is we sat on tatami mats in a hotel room. The table was a small, low table in the middle of the floor. There were 5 members of the committee and myself, 6 people. And so effectively there were 2 people here, 2 people here. No, there were 2 people here, 2 people here, 1 at each end. Okay? And the table in the center, and as we sat around this, there was a discussion. And the executive committee did its work. 1 person was the chair of the committee, but the committee voted on everything. All of the business that was taken care of. I have rather extensive notes because one of the members translated for me most of the things that were done. And at the end of this meeting, you could see that the whole thing was done on the basis of collective discussion and consensus. Even though they voted, it was always a consensus vote. And that there was nothing done that they didn't all agree on in that executive committee of 5. There were some issues that they said we can't decide. And I remember very specifically, there was an issue having to do with the women's rally. And they said, well, you know, this is what we think ought to be done, but we have to consult with the women on this, and they have to have input in it before we can make the decision. And so there was a rather long discussion and very clear opinions of what needed to be done, but they said we can't do it. We have to consult with the Women's Committee, and the Women's Committee will decide, and then together we will decide the decision. Now, once again, you see the collective nature and the majority rule characteristic, the dynamics of leadership. If we look at what happened in Korea this past week, there's a very interesting phenomenon. In Korea, we have a clear organization. In every university president's office, in every pastor's office, there was a setup that looked exactly like this. Everyone. You walked into, I visited 2 seminaries and 2 universities, and in every one, when I walked into the president's office, this was the arrangement. Okay? I visited 3 churches, and in every church, when I was invited into the pastor's office, this was the arrangement. 2 of them were Presbyterian, 1 was Methodist, so they're not even the same denomination. Okay, now, what you see here, guess, what is this? The head, that's right, the president, okay? The president or the pastor. Okay, now the most fascinating thing occurred when I had a meeting on a Thursday night with a key official in the Presbyterian Church and a group of high school principals. The high school principals had gathered. They were sitting in this exact kind of an arrangement. And we had started the meeting, and after we were about 10 minutes into the meeting, a man walked in. He was a man 78 years of age. Immediately, there was a big discussion over here as to where he should sit. And the man who was sitting here jumped up and moved down here. And the elderly man was told, you must sit there. He was going to sit down here. They said, no, 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 you can't sit there. And they made him come up and sit here. This man moved. This man said, no, no, I'll move. I'll go down here. And the guy said, no, no, you stay there. And there was a discussion, debate between them, and the man who went here insisted that this man stay. And so they let it go at that. But the eldest man that came in, 78, they would not let him sit down here. They made him come up and sit there. Now, what this said right away is that there is a pecking order in terms of where people should sit. And that the decision had to be made for this elderly man to sit there. In fact, later on at dinner, he asked me to guess his age, and I foolishly said 80. And his face fell, because I should have said 70. You know, no, I'm 78. But when I said 80, and he said, oh, I'm 78, he looked a little bit older than, I mean, I don't know why I guessed 80. I shouldn't have. But, you know, that was one of those faux pas that I made in the process. But in looking at this, age would be the criteria for where they would sit. The oldest would sit here, the youngest would sit here. And where did I sit? I sat right in here. Okay. And they didn't argue with me about that. But it's interesting enough, when I went into the pastor's office on Sunday in the big church where I preached, they put me right here. And on Sunday evening when we came in and there was a guest speaker who was a baseball player, a professional baseball player, they placed him right there. And so we sat across from each other in these particular positions. And the pastor sat here when he came in, but sometimes, in fact, later on that evening, the pastor came in and sat down here because he wasn't taking the authoritative role.
So you define those positions as authority.
That's right. Symbolic
authority or skill authority?
Oh, they're clearly related to age and symbolic power. They're power authority, not skill authority, in this framework. Okay. And I would guess that when the pastors come in for a pastoral meeting in a large pastoral staff, the senior pastor is always here, the senior assistants would be here, perhaps the rest of the place would be according to age. I haven't seen those meetings. But what you see here is not a majority unit, but what we'll call a corporate unit. Okay, in which there is a clear hierarchical structure. Misspelled. Okay, so corporate unit with a hierarchical structure. Now, in looking at this process, in the meeting that I attended of the principals, the leader of the meeting played a very important role in the process to find what would be done, when it would be done, and what should the decision outcomes. In fact, I was instructed before the meeting to begin that I was to invite the principals to visit Biola when they were in California. So when the time came to the end, I invited them. And then this man who had moved down here, who really should have been up here, said, well, I'm in charge of organizing the trip, and we'll not only be happy to come, we'll ask you to help us in the process, which they did. Now, I realized they'd been set up. In other words, the leader knew that this is what they wanted to do and anticipated that we were asking them for support, so they should have the right to ask us for support. Now, again, it's reciprocity. I don't mean set up in a negative way. I just mean that because I was asking for support, they then were saying, yes, we're willing to give it. There's a price to pay. There always is a price to pay. And so we then went through the process of negotiating, and we're going to be hosting 15 Korean high school principals here at Biola sometime in January, helping them make the arrangements. I want them to come to the school. I want them to see our school. I want them to have an opportunity. And the leader of the meeting knew that, and knew that this would be an opportunity for us to work this out. Now, this man had moved here, but he was here in the beginning, you see, and that's why he sat there, because he was the one who had the authority to organize this trip. He was the head of that group, and it was the elder man who came in that bumped him out of his seat. He then moved down here, would not take the second seat, you know, but he still was clearly one in authority and had been in that seat when we began.
Was your status regarded higher than age there?
In this situation, I was a guest, and it's interesting. The principals came in and sat here, and the guests were sitting here. And I don't remember exactly where I sat. I think I was in the first or second seat here, and nobody was in the first one.
Was it your foreignness or your Symbolic authority.
My symbolic authority.
Okay.
Provost and Senior Vice President of Biola. The Senior Vice President is very important. You know, that's the part that everybody kept repeating. You know, they don't know what Provost is, but the Senior Vice President, that signifies age. Very important in their structure. So, corporate unit, hierarchical structure, and the key person here directing. Now, the key difference between Japan and Korea was that in Japan, you did not have a key person directing. And in fact, when the Billy Graham of Japan says, Echanimitsu Christian Center will support you, but I have to take it to the board, he was saying, I don't have the authority to do this on my own. In this situation, the authority was very clearly in the pastor's seat in the churches where I visited. The pastor would say, this is going to happen, that was going to happen. People listened and they would do it. So it was a corporate structure with independent authority at the top. Now let's come back to atoms. In thinking about the material from atoms, it'll be very helpful for us to look at the table that is on page 57. In the book that you have, you'll notice it there. And this particular table talks about different kinds of operating units. And if you'll notice, on the column that you have on the right side, if I'm holding it to you, it'd be on your left side. Okay, my right side, your left. This column has the factors of power that we talked about. The first column says members have separate independent power. The second category says members identify common membership. The third one, members grant power reciprocally. I should say these are identifying rows. The fourth row, members allocate power centrally. The fifth row, central leader exercises power independently. And the sixth row, the central leader delegates power. Now what Adams is saying is that operating units get more complex as the power arrangements become more complex. And so in going across then, he identifies 7 different operating units. And the first one, the individual, the aggregate unit, has only members having independent power. Now effectively that's what this class is. You are members of this class, but each of you has independent power. You're just an aggregate group. It's like a pile of rock. That's what aggregate means, you know. It just, there's nothing to hold it together. It's just there. And so you have an aggregate group of people who have independent power, just happen to be in the same room or happen to be in the same location. But if they form an identity unit and have a common membership, if you go out and identify yourselves as common members of Lingenfelter's class on leadership, then you've taken one step up. Now, you might not ever do that, but you might be working in the library on this paper that was due last week, and people come up and say, what's going on here? Why are all the ICS students here in the library? We're all working on Lingenfelter's leadership paper. And so at that point, you become identity units. You know, you're identifying together because of your mutual pain, and you share that with others at that particular point. If you go the next step and you grant power reciprocally, and you say, hey, let's do all this thing together. What we're going to do is we're going to assign these 3 people to, well, let's say that I gave an exam, which I don't do, okay? And you decided that there was so much to read that we're going to assign 3 people to read this section of atoms, and another 3 people to read the next section, another 3 people to read the third section, and then you all prepare a summary and report, and then you all get together and we'll discuss our various summaries and report. So what you do is together you allocate power to particular segments of the class. Then at that point you have moved into a coordinated unit because you're granting power reciprocally among each other. And you basically now begin to coordinate your activities in terms of what you do. In fact, the fact that you're working together on these team projects means that the team projects are coordinated units. You grant power reciprocally to each other in the team. So if you're on a team of 2 or 3, that team, if 2 or 3, is a coordinated unit. You, as individual members, have said, well, we're going to do the research project together. We're required to do it by Lingenfelter, and so you then work on that together. The consensus units are units in which power is allocated centrally. Now, a consensus unit says we all have to agree before we can do anything. And so the allocation of power is one that it's not given to any individual, but it's given to the collective. And so collectively we agree we'll work together when we agree. And we won't do anything until we agree on it. And so you agree to work together and you keep talking about it until you get to that. In the Yapese society that you've read about, consensus was a very important dynamic in decision making. And the Yapese villages very often worked on the basis of consensus. Families in particular were consensus units, but they also allocated power to a central leader, which you know if you've read the book. So all right, the next set is when the central leader exercises power independently of others. In that particular situation, then, the consensus unit becomes a majority unit. In other words, that there is the possibility of the leader having power independent of others to be able to do things, but they have to keep checking back. The situation that I described for you in Japan, in which the leader said, we will support Biola, but he has to check back with the majority, which he was going to the board to do, is he had independent power, he could exercise power, but in this case it was bringing an outside organization in. And he didn't really have the authority to do that, so he had to check with the majority unit again to be sure that that would be okay. He did have authority, for example, to take us out to lunch and spend the Christian Center's money on that lunch. That was his authority to do that. But to actually provide space and support for us in the center, that's something he had to check with the board. He didn't have independent authority to do that. Now, when the central leader delegates power, that gets us down to the corporate unit that we've talked about there. And so what you have then is all 7 of those things operating in corporate units. And that's, I've described the Korean situation as a corporate unit, a hierarchical structure in which the pastor delegates power to other members in the organization, and which he then tells them what to do and they do it. And there is significant independent power on the part of the central leader. And in fact, what you see here is when the pastor begins to delegate, or the president begins to delegate, he has much more independent power than does the Japanese situation, in which the majority continues to hold control and exercise collective authority in terms of their relationships together. So the majority rule pattern that I saw working in Japan does not allow the leaders to have the power of delegation and the power of independence that you see in Korea. In Korea, there's more of the central authority with greater power to delegate and greater exercise of independent power in the corporate structure that I've described. The last unit is called an administered unit in Adams. And administered units, he then notes, are variable in terms of the presence of these other factors. The key thing about administered units are that the central leader exercises power independently and the central leader delegates power. There's much more significant independent power in the administered unit. And probably there are some, you might even get in some Korean situations administered units as opposed to corporate units. Less corporate accountability, greater power in the central leader. My observation in the universities were that there was a great deal of corporate responsibility in universities. The term, for example, of the president is 4 years. And at the end of 4 years, the president's term ends. And the term could be elected to a second 4-year term, but I met 2 presidents while I was there whose terms had ended at 4 years and they were not reelected. And both of them said to me that the president's job was a very difficult one. There was a tremendous amount of pressure and conflict. And so there was this corporate structure, and the leader wanted to do things but was held accountable in this framework, and a lot of tension and conflict within it, and the 4-year term was over. With the pastors of these churches of 500, they seem to be more administered units than corporate units. They seem to have more independent power, and they delegate more power independently. Now, I don't have a lot of data to base that on, but in watching them in the dynamic interactions that I saw, the presidents seemed to be much more humble and much more accountable because their terms ended. Whereas the pastors seemed to have an indefinite term. Their power was based upon the success of their churches, and they were growing. You know, I mean, this one church that I preached at in the last Sunday there had a goal. They had 2,000 cell groups. They had a goal of 5,000 by the year 2000. And so their goal was to continue to grow, to continue to reach people for Christ. And there was a dynamic support of the people in the process to keep going on it. So as you see these two churches and you see the dynamics that they're operating on, it provides a framework for understanding Adam's analysis. Now, I took time to go into this. What I want to do now is to go back and look at power and authority structure in the New Testament, because some would argue that the Japanese structure and the Korean structure are not biblical. And they would argue, or perhaps some would argue, that the Japanese structure is more biblical than the Korean structure. The Korean structure isn't biblical. And what I would like to do is to explore with you some of the data that we find in the New Testament and then come to some assessment of this. First of all, let me just briefly talk about some presuppositions. I think in the process of looking at this, a very common presupposition by most people coming to this was that there was a single church structure. No matter which group you talk to, whether it's the Episcopalian, ecclesiastical, or the Roman Catholic ecclesiastical organizations, or the Plymouth Brethren and the Brethren who are very oriented toward elder organizations and independent congregations, or the Congregational and the Presbyterian, they all argue that theirs is the church structure. And that's been a fairly typical process in church history, that people have looked at it as a single structure, and they look at the Scriptures as a unified theological document with single-mode solutions. I would like to suggest to you that there is an alternative way of looking at this, and the alternative I've described as one, historical events that have a developmental cycle over time. In other words, that things in the New Testament changed as history changed and as people responded to the dynamics of history. And so if we look at the New Testament and ask the question, is there a developmental cycle? What are the phases of it? We might get a different answer than if we went to the New Testament and said, what is the structure of the church? What are the dimensions that we find theologically explained? If you ask that question, you'll come up with one answer. If you ask the question I'm asking, you'll come up with a different one, because you're looking for different kinds of evidence. On the one hand, you're looking for the evidence that provides you with the structure, which is biblical. On the other hand, you're asking the question, what is the dynamic historical process, and how did the church adapt to it, and how did it reflect that adaptation at the change in time? So the two questions will yield possibly different results. You should ask both sets. The other thing that I am going to suggest to you is that changing structure of control occurs as the environment being controlled changes. Now you see I'm reflecting on atoms, and I'm saying that the environment being controlled will change because people have different resources at different times, different populations, and as the populations and resources change, then the structure of control will have to change to adapt to these changes in population. All right, let's take a look then at different environments, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Corinth, and let's take a look at different times and see if in fact there is evidence for this. In this lecture, I'm going to use Adam's chart that we just went through as a framework for thinking about what goes on in the New Testament and ask the question, do we see a progression from aggregate units to administered units? Is it possible that this happens in the New Testament? Is there evidence for it? And let's look and just see what we find. In terms of looking at the text, I start out with Luke chapter 34 and John chapter 20. Our time is somewhat limited, so let's just take a quick look at John chapter 20. We'll skip the Luke text. In looking at John chapter 20, you have the issue of Jesus' resurrection, and after the resurrection, you have him appearing to the disciples. And the First thing, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene in verse 10. The disciples went back to their homes. Mary stood outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she bent over and looked at the tomb and saw 2 angels. I won't read the rest of the story, but Jesus appeared to her first. Then it says, verse 18, Mary of Magdala went to the disciples with the news, "I've seen the Lord." And she told them what he'd said these things to her. Now, verse 19 says, on the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were gathered together with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came before them, stood before them and said, "Peace be with you." Now, just a side comment here. The evening of the first day of the week is always sundown after the Sabbath. So this would have been Saturday night. And for those of you that know the Jewish calendar goes from the sundown to sundown. So Saturday night is when they gathered. That's the first day of the week in the Jewish system. This is why I think we ought to have church services on Saturday night instead of Sunday morning. But of course, this is just for fun. All right. In this situation, then, you had them gathered together the evening of that first day. The disciples were together, the doors locked for fear of the Jews. Okay? Fear is what brings them together. That's my point. They come together to remember on the first day of the week after the Sabbath. It's fear. They've locked the door. And Jesus appeared to them. And he said to them, they were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Now, the next verse 26 says, a week later, his disciples were in the house again. Thomas was with them, and though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood with them again. So this shows them gathering after the Sabbath, the evening of the first day of the week, and they do this on 2 occasions. They don't seem to have an organization in these. If you read the accounts, you go back and read Luke, it seems to be they have an identity, a common identity, having been with the Lord, and they have a common fear, the fear of the Jews, and that seems to be the dynamic that holds them together. We don't see any real leadership emerging until a few weeks later. And if you flip over the page to Acts chapter 1, you see that in Acts chapter 1, verse 15, it says, in those days, Peter stood up among the believers, a group numbering about 120, and said, "Brothers, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit spoke long ago through the mouth of David concerning Judas, who served as a guide for those who arrested Jesus. He was one of our members and served with this ministry." He goes on and quotes in verse 20, "May his place be deserted, let there no one be to dwell in it, and may another take his place of leadership." Verse 21, Peter says, "Therefore it is necessary to choose one of the men who've been with us the whole time with the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from John's baptism to the time Jesus was taken up." And so they proposed 2 men, verse 23, and they prayed, "Lord, you show us, you know everyone's heart, show us which one of those." They drew lots, and the lot fell to Matthias, so he was added to the 11. Here is some formal decision-making being made now. Peter makes a proposal. They agree with it. There is reciprocal action. Okay? So what I'm suggesting to you here is that in Acts chapter 1, you have the evidence now of coordinated activity. In fact, in John 21, you see Peter taking some leadership there. He says, "I'm going fishing." And the others say, "Well, we'll go with you." And so Peter becomes the dynamic catalyst, a coordinating force to get people to work together. And he does it in John 21. He does it here in Acts chapter 1. And you see then people responding. In reciprocal action in John 21, "Hey, we'll go with you." And they went fishing together. Some of the guys that went weren't fishermen, but they went along anyway because they were interested in following Peter, working with Peter in this context. And here you have the same thing happening. They worked together. They cast lots. They made a decision. First they chose 2, proposed 2, and then they cast lots. So there is coordination going on. Now, the next few pages give evidence that there was no central leader present in this early moment of the church. In Acts chapter 2, verse 41 to 47, it says that verse 42, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer." You notice here it's apostles, not Peter's teaching, but the apostles' teaching. So it's focused. 3,000 members were added in that first day, and then the apostles were the ones who were the leaders in terms of providing direction. In chapter 4, verse 32 to 37, you have the same kind of a statement. All believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any possessions was his own. They shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. Much grace was upon them. It says, verse 35, verse 34, they owned land, sold them, brought the money from sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. In chapter 5, we notice a subtle shift. Because in chapter 5, the Ananias and Sapphira sold a piece of property. They brought it and put it at the apostles' feet, but Peter now is the spokesman. And Peter is the one who is taking a particular leadership role in terms of the process. And in this situation, Peter is the one who rebukes Ananias and rebukes Sapphira, and he addresses this issue with them, and they both are struck by the Holy Spirit and die. And so you have here a sense of Peter's growing leadership within the church. Now, the next 5 chapters of Acts show Peter very prominent in the church. And I'll show you more as we go on. But in this early phase, in the first development of ministry, there seems to be coordination, reciprocal action, but no centralized leadership that we can identify particularly. Acts chapter 6 shows the substantive change. It says in chapter 6, verse 1, in those days when the number of disciples was increasing, the Grecian Jews among them complained against those of the Aramaic-speaking community because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. Okay, now what is that? Resources. Control over resources is the issue. Okay? And the conflict was about the fact that the resources were not being allocated equitably. Verse 2, the 12 gathered all the disciples together. So the 12 are clearly in leadership, a collective group, a consensus group. Gathered all the disciples together and said, it would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the Word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them, and we will give our attention to the prayer and the ministry of the Word. What kind of power are they proposing? Delegated. Exactly. They say, we will turn the power over to them. So in Acts chapter 6, you see the clear addition of delegated power. You also have implicit here allocated power. In fact, allocated power occurs earlier when people are bringing money. They're bringing food. They're putting it at the apostles' feet. And so the allocated power is already going on in terms of the operation of the process. And so the coordinated units involve the allocation of power. No, I should not say that. I should say granting of power. A lot of granting of power of individuals. Individuals bring in their resources, give it to the apostles. Ananias and Sapphira granted the apostles authority over the money they brought. At this point, however, it's allocated power because the group collectively says, we will appoint these people. We'll select them and we'll give them authority over. So the group allocates the power to the apostles. The apostles delegate the power to these people to handle the waiting on of tables. And it's interesting, their criteria. Choose 7 men known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over them. We'll give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the Word. And so they did it. Now, these men obviously did more than wait on tables. The story of Stephen and Philip are very powerful in the next chapters. We don't have time to take a look at them, but you can see that the leaders were sought for their ability. Stephen did more preaching probably than he did in waiting on tables, so Stephen probably delegated some more authority to others to do the waiting on tables. These men who were not apostles were given responsibilities and authority, and I'm sure that they delegated it to others. So you have the beginning development of a delegated system at this point. Now, Acts chapter 9, verse 31, shows us the prominence of Peter and the changes that occur in the church. Verse 31 says, the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace. That's crucial. Okay? The persecution dropped. It was it was strengthened and encouraged by the Holy Spirit. It grew in numbers, living in the Spirit of the Lord, living in the fear of the Lord. So a time of peace, a time of growth in numbers changes the social environment. It changes the number of people that have to be ministered to and the number of people involved in terms of discipling and teaching and the other kinds of things that are there. And you'll notice then that the story is about Peter, Aeneas, and Dorcas. Peter traveled about the country, verse 32. He went to visit the saints in Lydda. He's going around now visiting different groups of Christians. Peter is taking a key role in terms of leadership. The story of Cornelius is found in chapter 10. Peter is the one anointed by the Lord to go and preach to Cornelius. In chapter 11, you have Peter's clear role in terms of the leadership in the church. Chapter 11, verse 1, you have for the statement, the apostles and the brothers throughout Judea heard that the Gentiles had also received the word of God. So when Peter went up to Jerusalem, the circumcised believers criticized him and said, "You went into the house of uncircumcised men and ate with them." And then Peter explained what had happened. And verse 18 is the key verse in terms of this chapter. It says, when they heard this, they had no further objections and praised God, saying, "So then God has even granted the Gentiles repentance unto life." Now, Peter's argument was that the Holy Spirit came on the Gentiles before they laid hands on them. And so if God demonstrated by giving them the Holy Spirit, then what should we say? They hadn't yet been circumcised. They hadn't yet been sanctified with the Jewish customs of eating food, and God gave them the Holy Spirit. So why should we say that they need to be clean in the Jewish way? They accepted Peter's leadership. They accepted Peter's argument. So at this point, what you see is Peter playing a key role. Now, the final issue in this, the Scriptures don't give us a whole lot of information, but it gives us enough. Chapter 12, verse 17. The story of chapter 12 is Peter is imprisoned. The beginning of chapter 12, James, the brother of John, is put to death. And it says that Peter was put in prison, and Herod intended to bring him out for public trial at the Passover and to execute him, just like he'd executed James. So the Holy Spirit, the angel of the Lord, releases Peter from prison. And in verse 17, Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of prison. And then he says, "Tell James and the brothers about this," he said, and then he left for another place. Now the significance of this is that James becomes the next leader. In effect, Peter is delegating his authority to James, and he takes off. He flees because his life is in danger. He would be executed if he stayed, and so he turns the leadership over the church to James, and he's gone. Now the next time you see the Jerusalem church mentioned, James is clearly in charge in Acts chapter 15. And so you have the key role of James occurring. At this particular point in time, we're probably about 15 years from Pentecost. And by the time we get to Acts chapter 15, I can't remember now the time frame, but I think it's about 30 years from Pentecost by the time you get to Acts chapter 15. So the time framework is quite long in terms of what we would consider years. The growth of the church is dynamic during that time. The numbers increase quite drastically. And what you see happening is as the numbers increase, the problems change. The problem of the circumcision and uncircumcision burst open very clearly in Acts chapter 11. The persecution revives again in Acts chapter 12. Peter then, his life is threatened. He leaves. James is delegated to be the next head of the church at that particular point, and that follows. Now, you have in Acts chapter 15 and 13 evidence for what we would call a corporate structure. In Acts chapter 13, in actual fact, in Acts 11:32, you have some evidence for corporate structure. In 11:32, you have, I'm sorry, 11:22, you have news of the conversion of Gentiles in Antioch, and so the church at Jerusalem, verse 22, sent Barnabas to Antioch to find out. Delegated authority. Barnabas, you go, you find out what's happened, report back to us. Let us know what's going on there. And so Barnabas does that. Barnabas also stays and ministers there. And then in Acts chapter 13, verse 1, the church at Antioch, gives delegated power to Paul and Barnabas and sends them out. And this is a classic passage. And Acts 13, 1-3 is one that many people use to argue that a plurality of elders is the structure of the church, and we should use that. What I would argue here is that Antioch came up with a different solution than Jerusalem did. That in Antioch, where you had Gentiles and Jews involved in the church, you were coming up with a little bit of a different authority structure than you had in Jerusalem, where the authority seemed to be similar to that based in the Sanhedrin. The Jerusalem church seems to follow the structure of the Sanhedrin and parallel it. And you have an authority that is based upon a high priest, and then subordinate leaders under the high priest, experts in the law, being the structure there. Peter seems to be the equivalent of the high priest. When Peter has to flee, James takes over Peter's place as the equivalent of the high priest. Whereas in Antioch, which has Gentiles, you have a little different dynamic occurring, and that structure there operates in a different way. Again, the evidence is very skimpy, but it seems to be Antioch is responding somewhat differently than you have in Jerusalem. I think if you go to Ephesus, Ephesus shows more of the elder structure that you see in Antioch. Again, I would argue reflecting some of the Gentile influence and perhaps the way things were done in the Gentile world. Now let me come back and give you a reason why I think this is true. Everywhere I study church leadership, I find the church leadership following significant parallels that already pre-exist in leadership before the church comes in. The Japan and Japanese cases, the Japanese and Korean case that I've shared with you. I went to the Korean village south of Seoul, and I was stunned as I walked into the magistrate's house of an 19th century Korean magistrate to find in that particular house in the center of the building a single platform set up above the floor about 8 inches upon which the magistrate sat. And then in the diorama opposite the magistrate, 2 individuals on either side looking toward each other with the magistrate in the center. The exact same structure I found in the university and in the churches. And it was fascinating to see that this operation in the universities and the churches was paralleled in the 19th century in a pre-Christian era in a traditional magistrate's house and in the operation of the magistrate in the traditional Korean government. Now, if you go to Japan, there's an article that I think I had in the reading in the leadership and then took it off, but I used it in the social organization class, on the organization of a Shinto festival in Japan. And in this organization of Shinto festival, they say that the leaders of the festival are primarily symbolic. And that the structure of organization is a consensus structure in which the majority rules in terms of how decisions are made. And that leaders have great recognition and symbolic power, but they don't really have decision-making power. They have to continue to consult with the group. And this is exactly the dynamic I saw with what I've called the Billy Graham of Japan. A great symbolic power, but somebody told me while I was there that his power is primarily symbolic, that really the board makes the decisions. Well, you see that in the traditional Shinto structure of the community in Japan. You see it happening in this church structure, and you see it happening in the other kind of organizations. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that there are certain social conditions that require certain kinds of leadership structures. There are also certain cultural conditions which lead people to choose certain structures to operate within them. That doesn't mean that Christian leadership should not be different. In fact, it should be. But it's interesting, when Jesus discusses leadership, he doesn't discuss the structure. He discusses the heart attitudes. When he talks to his disciples about this in the Gospel of Luke, he says, in the world, the leaders give orders and people run to do it. But he says, in chapter 22, I believe it is, that this is not the way it shall be among you. I am among you as one who serves. Who is greater, the one who sits at the table or the one that waits at the table? Of course, the one who sits at the table. But I am telling you that you should be like ones who wait on the table. Now, you notice in Acts chapter 6, the apostles say, we don't have time to wait on tables. In spite of what Jesus said, they said, we don't have. So,
We'll select people, we'll delegate the authority to waiting on tables to them. Were the apostles wrong in this? I don't think they were wrong. If we take Jesus' comments in Luke that they should be waiting on the tables, then they made a bad decision. But if we understand Jesus' comment in Luke and in John 13 as having to do with the heart attitudes about leadership, and Jesus said, I am Lord and Master, but I have washed your feet, so ought you with one another. Now, my own particular denomination takes that literally. We ought to be washing one another's feet. But in effect, both the Luke passage and the John 13 passage are passages in which Jesus is giving final instructions with regard to leadership. And they're both done at the Last Supper. And so they really explicate one another. And in Luke 22 or 24 and John 13 must be understood as parallel passages addressing the same issue, Christian leadership. And so Christian leadership is one where our heart attitude, even though we are master and we are in authority, our attitude, our direction, our pattern of leadership should be one of service, and a servant's attitude and a servant's heart as we work on it. Okay, so in thinking about this, basically the evidence then that we have here is one that says we go beyond this corporate unit structure in terms of how we deal with people. Our heart transformation, the process by which we work on leadership, is different and leads us to a different structure. It leads us to a different explication of structure. Okay, in the text that we have, I don't really have time to review Acts 15 in substance, but let's just take a quick look at some of the parts of it. Acts 15 is the best chapter to understand leadership down the road. In other words, let's say 20 to 30 years in the life of the church, Acts 15 tells us what was going on in Jerusalem. And so there's a dispute. It tells us in verse 1, Paul and Barnabas were in debate with others, so they came to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about the question. So clearly there is an authority in Jerusalem. If you look at the church, the authority center is in Jerusalem, otherwise they wouldn't have come there. They would have said, well, let's just settle this ourselves. When they came to Jerusalem, verse 4, they were welcomed by the church, the apostles, and the elders, to whom they reported everything God had done. And some of the believers who belonged to the party of Pharisees stood up. They presented their argument. Then Peter got up and addressed them. Now Peter appears again. Okay? And this particular point, Peter goes back over and rehearses what happened with Cornelius and what has happened in his ministry to the Gentiles. And he says, why are you putting a yoke on the neck of our brothers? The whole assembly was silent then as they listened to Paul and Barnabas. And then it says, when they finished, James spoke up. And James said, brothers, listen to me. Simon has described to us how God at first showed his concern. The words of the prophets are in agreement. Therefore, 19, he makes a decision. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Okay? He speaks authoritatively. He says, it's my judgment. And in that particular context, he then describes what we should do. And then the apostles and elders of the whole church decided to choose some of their own men and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And they sent the following letter. And the letter states basically what James had articulated. And the men then went off and delivered the letter. The people read it and were encouraged, and so on. It tells us in chapter 16, verse 4, that as Paul traveled with Timothy, they went from town to town. They delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders for Jerusalem for the people to obey. So you have this decision now being communicated out to the other groups in a systematic process. What we see here then is the fact that the rulers have some independent power. And even though there are a lot of people who disagree with the decision made by James, and they continue to oppose it and go about producing conflict throughout Paul's ministry, that James held the power to make that decision. The decision was then made and the edict passed out, and there were people delegated to carry the message, and there are power networks that emerged from that. You see that operating there. Now that's very different from what you see in Acts chapter 1, when Peter says, hey, we need to do this. what do you think? They agreed on it. It was more consensus decision making. And then they cast lots. Peter didn't make the decisions who should do it. It was done by lots. And then the next couple of chapters, you find the apostles together, people united in kind of a consensus unity. You don't need authority structure when you have only 3,000 people. But when you've got 20,000, hundreds of thousands, churches scattered all over the place, people beginning to disagree with one another, factions developing, then this authority structure emerges. Finally, one passage that's kind of striking to me is in Titus 1:5, where Paul says to Titus, I guess I should read it. I have it here. Let's just take a quick look at it. Paul says to Titus, the reason I left you in Crete was that you might straighten out what was left unfinished. Okay? Clear authority given. Straighten out what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. So Paul's giving directions. Titus is to follow them. There's clearly delegated authority in that particular context. So my argument would be that all of Adam's components are found in the New Testament, not just one. That the process moves from aggregate structures right through administered units. And that administered units is the complex situation we find at the time when Paul is sending out Titus to do the work in Crete. I'm willing to let you argue with me on this if you'd like, but the evidence seems to me to be there for this historical process and the changes it connects to the numbers of people, the resources that need to be managed, and the problems that need to be solved. What this would tell us then is that the Korean structure and the Japanese structure are viable in terms of the dynamics of the social situations they have there. Thank you very much.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.